Thank you to everybody who has participated in Season 4 for listening to the Voices in Our Heads, a podcast where creative minds get together and talk about their creative processes in a world that wasn't necessarily built for them. So we are now wrapping, as of this episode, Season 4. Season 5 is ahead. We will be filming the beginnings of it here very, very soon. If you would like to go ahead and join as a new friend or a returning friend, please go ahead and check out the link in the description box below. Thank you for all you do, and let's go ahead and jam. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Listening to the Voices in Our Heads. Sometimes those voices be mean to us. And we're going to talk with someone today about what it's like to go ahead and confront those mean voices so that way they're paying rent and cheering in your favor. Welcome, everyone, and join me with my friend, Kris. Let's get started. Welcome on back, everybody, to another episode of Listening to the Voices in Our Heads. My name is Jenna O'Malley. I am your soul writer, author of sci-fi fantasy with dashes of romance and nerdy references. And I am here with my friend, Kris. Tell us a little bit about yourself today, my friend.
Well, hello. Thanks so much for having me. So my name is Kris Faatz. I am a Baltimore local. I'm originally from Philly, and I am both a writer and a musician. I started out more on the music side and then discovered that I was really excited about writing. And now that has kind of become my thing over the last decade or so. It's become more of my focus. I have a couple of books out. My most recent one, 14 Stones, was released at the end of June by Highlander Press here in Baltimore. And I'm also a teacher, and I do some creative consulting with other writers.
Now, wait a minute. I did not realize that I'm talking to a Baltimore girl. I was born at University of Maryland in Inner Harbor and spent the first 8 years of my life on Lombard Street. What part of the city do you live in?
So I actually live north of the city now. I live in Parkville, but I moved down here from Philly to go to the Peabody Conservatory. So I lived right downtown on Monument Street for a few years.
Nice. Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh my goodness. I've been to the Peabody Conservatory as a student on a field trip a couple times. Lovely awesome. Place. Yes. If you ever get to visit Baltimore and you're bored, go see what they're doing because they always have amazing stuff going on. Mm-hmm. Wow. So, okay, I have some other questions, but we're not going to spiral too far off of our questions. What importance does having a supportive community really play in being a creative person, especially since you've relocated?
Yeah, so when I came to Baltimore, again, I was basically just a musician at that time, and it was wonderful to connect with other folks who were doing the same thing I was doing, very serious about music. And I was coming from a background where going into the arts was kind of a bizarre thing to do, that folks, didn't really get it and were kind of discouraging about it. So it was awesome to meet other folks doing the same thing, and it made a lot of difference to me. And what I've found is that even as I've been shifting over into writing, it has stayed really important to stay connected with other writers, especially because this can be a very solitary thing to do, And so it's been great to have both an online community of writers and folks that I talk to in person, to just kind of recenter and remind myself this is okay, what I'm doing is good, and we're kind of in this boat together.
Especially given that Baltimore is known as a port city, that's very appropriate for you to give that we're in this together kind of analogy. So is it okay then to acknowledge that family and friends might not be your ideal reader or stakeholder in your creative writer or writerly business? And how do you establish those boundaries?
I think it's not only okay, but it is essential. I think you've got to know who your tribe is. So I've definitely gone through the experience of feeling very discouraged and sort of cut down from feedback from the outside. And particularly, unfortunately, in my case, it was family. That was a real challenge. And so I think that in order to kind of protect ourselves and our craft and our imagination, and the things that we love to do, it is critical to kind of figure that out and say, okay, I know that this person is not going to be my reader. I know that this person doesn't get what I do, and that is okay. And I don't need to feel like oh, but I should share with them because, they're family or whatever. I think we can kind of get into that kind of easily because it's like, oh, well, you're supposed to be close to me. But I think it's totally fine. And in my case, what I generally do is I just decide I'm not going to share that with so-and-so, that's okay. And if I feel like if you're comfortable having a conversation with someone and saying, hey, especially if it's someone who kind of is trying to be supportive and doesn't know how to, and that gets a little tricky. And then you can say, hey, this is really what would be most helpful to me when I share my work with you is if you can look at it this way, if you can give me this kind of feedback, that's wonderful. But I think it is super important to do what you need to do to protect yourself.
That's a muscle a lot of us who tend to work alone in isolation don't get to exercise as often as we think. So I'm glad you worded it the way you did, because we don't like exercising that muscle. But you're right. We've got to put in the reps and strengthen that one for sure. So what areas of self-improvement for authors or creators, what could they benefit from, even if the suggestion is how to write or how not to write or publish in some sort of program?
For me, honestly, the biggest thing has been finding ways to stay kind of centered. And I'm probably going to keep coming back to that idea, but like finding ways to stay centered in what I'm doing and what matters to me. Because I feel like feedback can get so overwhelming. I mean, from well-intentioned folks, from maybe folks on the more critical side, and also just, I think as artists, we can get caught up in comparison, like so-and-so over here just sold all these books and now I'm feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing enough or I'm not being enough. So it is just important to me always to remember why I'm doing what I'm doing. And to kind of keep in mind that, and I think this is true for all of us as artists, is that like, if we did not do the work, that work wouldn't exist. So when we put something out that is ours and creative, I actually said this to a class recently. I said, you're changing the world by definition, because this is what you're doing, creating what didn't exist. And so I think that just finding those ways to remind ourselves when the world gets really loud, or, if we feel discouraged, or, I just got my 75th rejection of something, finding those ways to come back and say, yes, this is why I'm doing it. I think that's super important.
Even Formula 409 had a why, or else they wouldn't have tried 408 failures first, is something that a college professor of mine told us early. And I'm like, oh my goodness, you're not wrong. It takes a lot of audacity, literally, to want to keep going that route. So what's the one moment where you're the most proud or audacious along your learning path of being a writer, author, musician, creative?
I think I'd have to say, I mean, there are different moments that I'm proud of that have to do with kind of specific things that I did, like this project or this maybe, like getting a particular story out into the world, getting it published. But I think in the more general way, I am just really proud of making the decision to invest in myself as an artist and saying, okay, this is what I'm going to do.
You went to one of the best conservatories on the East Coast for a reason, sweetheart. Oh my goodness. There are people of us who grew up in Baltimore who dreamed of being able to go there for a reason, and just wow. So how much did even just going there prepare you for it? If you want to talk about your experience a little bit at the conservatory versus now.
Sure. So that was my big self-investment, was saying I'm going to go to grad school for music. It was a huge and difficult deal. And again, that was kind of a family situation. And so deciding to do that and just kind of going for it, and in spite of everything, saying this is what I'm going to do. It definitely changed things a lot for me. And then in terms of, I thought I was going to be a professional musician. My plan was to stick with that. And then I got there, and when I was experiencing making music in these big groups, because I'm a pianist, but I was part of a chorus and I was doing stuff, with like the orchestral program. And so being on stage in these big groups of people and making this incredible music, and it was just so affirming and uplifting. And I decided I wanted to try to capture that feeling. I was going to try to write about it. And I'd sort of been into writing when I was in junior high and high school, but I'd never done much serious with it. And I decided I was going to try writing a book because, hey, it's going to be easy. I've got all this stuff I want to write about. No problem. Like 6 months, right? Well, 10 years later, my first book came out. So it was definitely a bigger process than I thought. But just the kind of figuring out how to take those experiences of performing and what the music sounded like and what it felt like, putting it onto the page. And I realized writing is what I really, really love to do, and it just kind of, there were other things. I was working on this novel and banging my head against the wall. And then I started playing around with short stories and I was like, oh, I like this too, so let me try this other thing. And it just kind of took off from there.
Love it. So you thought that writing or storytelling rather with music was your calling. Yes. But apparently the music of your life is writing. I love that. I love that so much. So do you think a lot of what you learned at the conservatory prepared you to be an author though?
That's a really interesting question. I think that yes, in a lot of ways, that training, especially like for a pianist, you're going to go sit in the practice room, you're going to woodshed, you're by yourself, for hours at a time. You're going to be super picky. You're going to, keep working on this one passage till you really nail it. I would say yes, absolutely, because I do the same thing, as a writer. And also just, I think probably having training as a performer. I remember the first time I did a reading, it was at a writing workshop, a summer writing workshop. And all of us who were students in the workshop gave readings, these little 3-minute readings. And I remember a lot of folks in my group were really, really scared. I mean, it was like, oh my gosh, getting on that stage and reading And I was like, you know what? I mean, I have sat down and played an hour-long recital in front of an audience. Like, this is fine, like no sweat, right? So I think a lot of that did prepare me also for the stressors of putting work out there and thinking like, oh gosh, people are going to have opinions and but I was getting kind of used to that just by doing the performance practice.
And I'm glad you worded it that way. Something I often say as a writing and book coach to people is, do you know what stage fright is? I think you have page fright. And to hear you word it like that, it's like really, truly, if you're used to, I'm putting in my reps, I'm putting in my show ups, I'm putting in the time at the gym, the rehearsal, whatever, it's second nature to you. And I'm glad those skills are there for you, especially given our next question is going to go back to being a little bit on the heavier side. How do you navigate conversations with family or friends who don't see writing as a real job, given how they responded to you doing a master's that's musical?
Yeah, that has been tricky. I've had to do, again, kind of getting back to self-protection, I've had to do a lot of self-protection. And again, some of that is just knowing when it's okay to share, when it's safe to share, when it's not safe to share. With certain people, talking about what I do is just not going to be something they get, and that is just a thing that I know. It has been really tough because I definitely bought into that for a long time. That's sort of like, well, writing's not a real job. Like, when are you going to get a real job? When are you going to do some real adulting, And I think a lot of it is just, I've just kept on doing it. And now I can look back at not just, okay, I've written a bunch of stuff, but also I've learned so much and I've put in so much time. And it's like, yeah, this is as valid as any real job I can think of. We are creating, we're making something new and we're putting in the discipline and the time. So I feel like if I know for myself that is true, it makes it a lot easier to navigate some of that other stuff.
That's a very good point. It is a lot about, like you said, that balance of the discipline and time. Mm-hmm. What strategies otherwise do you use to maintain your self-confidence and motivation in the face of skepticism? Like, are there certain phrases you could share with others to try, or certain examples of, without naming names, of course, times where it was beneficial for you to say, even though you asked, maybe I should answer this way?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a couple things, and I'll try to keep my thoughts organized and not start wandering off. So I actually just taught recently a workshop. It was a one-off workshop that was part of a day-long program for writers here at the Eastern Shore. And the session was called A Place to Stand, and it was the central idea was staying grounded in the writing life. And we did a couple of exercises that I think were powerful for everyone. It was actually really powerful for me to do because I hadn't done it for myself before either. But thinking about something that makes you proud of your work, something that is uniquely yours. What is it that you do that, because of course, anything that we do, we're bringing our own experience and our own voice. And so no matter whether someone else might be working in the same genre, they're not going to do exactly what you're doing. So what is it that is specifically yours? And for me, I was like, well, what do I really love about my writing? So let me kind of brainstorm about that, kind of journal about that. And that sort of thing, I think tapping into our own creativity can be so powerful, and saying, yeah, what is it about what I do? And I do come back to that idea of we do change the world. There's a quote from James Baldwin that I've been kind of obsessing over lately, where he says, writers write because we want to change the world, and we know that we can't do it on the grand scale. But every time we connect with a reader, and I'm wildly paraphrasing here, but every time we connect with a reader, we put that one thing out there, we're making a millimeter of change. And so I sort of tell myself, yeah, this is my millimeter, and that's worth it.
It's very much, I have a quote on my desktop right now that says, be the ripple. You feel like a drop in an ocean, but your ripples are going to go way further than you realize. So I'm glad, I think I know what Baldwin quote you're talking about. And I'm really glad you brought that one back. Have you found any supportive communities or networks that help you to counteract your negative perceptions or to break that cycle? For example, do you have a friend that has to go to family stuff with you and help you ward off the bullies? Or is there an online group you could suggest?
So this might sound pretty awful, but in my case, I have done, I would call it sort of house cleaning over the last couple of years that has had a lot to do with really minimizing toxic situations, toxic people. I sort of hit a point where there was just way too much of that. And working in therapy, my therapist is like, you know what, you don't have to just put up with this all the time. And there are people that I do not interact with anymore. And it was just like, you know what, this is a sad thing. It's a tough thing because we're family, but this is not good for me. And I need to be able to do my stuff. And especially if you feel like you've tried and tried and tried, and you've really tried to have that connection and maintain it, and it is just not working. And it's like, all right, law of diminishing returns, right? So that is not something that I would lightly wish on anybody. I mean, it's a really tough thing to have to do, but sometimes it is necessary. And I will say too, that I have had, especially, so I wanted to mention the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop is one of the ones that I've done that is just a wonderful group of people. I've gone a few times. I've made a bunch of friends there, and the connections there, people who really get the discipline and the experience of writing. We stay connected. The workshop is a 1-week thing in the summer, but you stay connected online and everything. And that has helped a lot. And also just generally having contacts with other artists who've been through similar things. And I have some Facebook friends I've never met in person, but we've got really good connections on Facebook, and we talk about a lot of these things. And it helps to know that I'm not alone, and that my experience is not bizarre, and that lots of us go through stuff like this.
It may seem bizarre within our own nuclear families, but in the greater scheme of writers, it's normal.
Yeah, exactly.
So what advice would you give to other writers who are facing unsupportive or dismissive attitudes? Is there like a calming down technique? Like, you're in the moment, what is the one thing that you do to shut them down wording wise? Obviously not wanting to be brash, or depending on who they are you brash?
I think that can really depend. I think in some cases it's enough for me to just take a breath and kind of step back and say, you know what, I'd rather not talk about this right now. Which is hard, it can be hard. In other instances, again, kind of like what I was saying before, if you feel like the other person is really making the effort, then maybe it's worth trying to have the conversation and say, okay, well, this is why this isn't super helpful, or this is why I'm having trouble. I'm feeling this way, hearing you say that, I'm feeling this way, can we try to figure out something healthier? Sometimes I feel like mirroring can be a really good technique to try for someone who is, again, like a person who's really trying to make an effort. And you can say, like, this is what I'm hearing when you say that. Is that really what you meant? And now you can try to have a back and forth. But I also, one of the things that I love to do and this is maybe less in the moment and more as either preparation or coming down from something that has been, this was really awful. Revisiting something that I'm working on or a project that is finished, but was something that I really had fun working on, and just kind of tapping into it. I did that a lot when I was working on my third book and sort of in a tough work-related situation, and I would just sit down with it, and even if I didn't actually do any work, I would pull up, here, let me just pick a random page and start reading it. And it was so grounding, again, as that reminder of this is something that I love, and it fills me up, and it makes me feel like my feet are firmly planted on the ground, and I remember who I am. And so no matter what else is happening out there, this is who I am, and that is okay. And I think that is just a huge thing to be able to remember, is like, no, I'm okay. It's okay that this is who I am.
And I love how you brought that back full circle and gave us a tip of how to trigger, not necessarily trigger, but glimmer, I guess would be the word to say, glimmer our ways into getting there. So are there any particular books, podcasts? You mentioned maybe therapy might be appropriate for some people when it comes to dealing with the imposter syndrome and external negativity.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Therapy has been huge for me. It has been essential. And I've been really lucky the last couple of years to be working with a therapist who specifically works with artists and creative people. And that, I think, is something.
Oh, wow. We have one of those in Maryland? I'm sorry. I'm like, wait a minute. What? Maryland has those now?
Yes, we do.
Sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
No problem. Yeah. So he is a musician himself, and just has a lot of experience working with artists. And so one of the things we talk about a lot is imposter syndrome. And we talk about how, and maybe this is something too that can be helpful, is I have a bit of OCD. And so when my brain gets going, when the critic gets going, it's very loud and it's very insistent. But one of the things he and I talk about a lot is how thoughts are just thoughts. And so it doesn't mean it's true. The fact that you're thinking it, the fact that you're obsessing over it as I do, it doesn't mean it's true. You can just have those thoughts and say, okay, that's there, but I can choose. Am I going to pay attention to it? Am I going to decide to believe it? Or am I going to decide to, let me go think about something else now. Let me go focus on something else now. So that has been very helpful for me. Also, I don't know if you're familiar with The Artist's Way, but that is a book that has been very helpful too.
I just finished rereading that one. Good read. Good read.
Yeah. When I was kind of getting started with my first book and feeling like, oh, I don't know about investing in myself as a writer, that was really good. It was kind of a sort of reminder that, yeah, that's okay. You can take the time and you can write the pages every morning and you can give yourself that routine. And that did a lot for me.
That's definitely a solid suggestion. So how's your perception of your own work changed, especially in light of the external pressures you're going with?
I would say, my critic is still very active. And I think for any of us who have been in that situation of doing creative work that people close to you, I mean, if you grew up in a family that just didn't understand it, which is the situation I was in, that critic is going to be really loud, and is going to have a lot to say. And so I can be very hard on my work. I think I have gotten better about that over time. I've gotten to the place where I actually love revision, so I write the crappy first draft and then I can come back to it and say, okay, we have some puzzle pieces, we have some building blocks, let's jump in here. And I don't have to kind of, oh my gosh, this is so bad. I'm just so awful at this. It's much more like, oh, this is fun. Let's see what we can make out of this. So I think that has been a shift. I don't have to be quite so defensive about those early drafts. I can relax and say, yeah, okay, there's stuff that doesn't work here and that's fine. And I feel much more confident in my own voice and the kinds of things that I want to be writing about, what my style feels like. When I started out, I think I felt a lot of pressure to try to, oh, I need to make this stuff that people will like, or I need to make this something that a certain readership is going to like, very literary or very, you know, whatever. And now it's more sort of like, no, I can write what feels important to me and what gives me a lot of satisfaction, and that's fine. And as I'm finding that it's finding its readers, you know, I'm saying, okay, there's people out there who want to read this stuff, and great, you know, that's awesome.
I love it. I love it. I love it. So before we wrap up and wind down our conversation for the day, do you have any questions for me?
I wondered if I could ask a writerly question.
Go for it.
Okay. So I was looking at your site and I was looking at your books, and I love the fantasy, especially because that's what I do, and using fantasy as a way to comment on real stuff, you know, stuff that's happening in the world. That's a huge thing for me, and that's what I was doing with my second book especially. So I was wondering if you've got a favorite character, and who it might be and why.
Oh God, you would ask this question because I'm sure a lot of my readers are like, yeah, that's what we want to know too. His name is Frey, and he causes a lot of shenanigans. The only reason why I'm going to have to pick him is it's literally his fault that my 5-book series became 5 books. It started as a trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
He decided to up and disappear for 6 weeks in the middle of book 2, and I'm like, I can't use you in this battle scene now. What do I do? It's going to take me 2 books to fix this, isn't it? And that's why his book felt incomplete, because it caused ripple effects that I didn't see. And I'm like, ugh. Mm-hmm. So Frey, just because he's the redheaded stepchild, and I'm going to hug him.
Yeah. I love it. That's awesome.
He is very much, I think, the reason why a lot of my readers enjoy him. He's the inner child that wants to say stuff that we say, hey, no, you go behave. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He's that friend. So he's very much an excuse to cut loose and just be humorous in a world that's rather dark. So I think there's not enough of that in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for picking the hard question.
I'm sorry.
No, fair is fair. This is fair game. I return it to you. Who would be your favorite?
Oh, okay. So in my book that Highlander Press released at the end of June, so 14 Stones has 4 main protagonists, and we alternate chapters by viewpoint. One of those 4 is a priest. His name is Rebus Silvicus. He is my favorite character in this book, and he's a very close contender for my favorite character ever. Kind of tied with the protagonist of my 3rd book, the one that's not out yet. But Rebus was the reason that I wrote 14 Stones. I have this need to kind of fall in love with one character so I can really invest in a project. And he is the one I fell in love with. He's I describe him as the good-hearted man with the bad heart. He has a physical problem that is sort of functions as a handicap. It holds him back in a lot of ways, but he also has this mental ability that in some ways more than compensates and in some ways makes his life much more difficult. But he's this kind of inherently kind person. That's really what he sort of brings to everything is this kindness. And so that was what I really loved about him. And I also loved the contradiction between this power and then this, you know, physical issue. So I love him, and he was really wonderful to work with and really difficult to work with because, you know, your favorite, you want to get it right, right? So you feel a lot of pressure. But yeah, he was the driving force behind 14 Stones.
Love it. Love it. So I have one other follow-up questions before we get out to shout out in the community. I've met with a couple of your friends from Highlander Press. How did you meet Debbie?
Yes. So we've known each other for about 20 years. We met when her son Cooper was starting to take piano lessons and I was his teacher. And we worked together all the way. He went all the way through high school, stopped piano in freshman year, but then he was singing and I was accompanying him in some local stuff that he did. So that was how we met. And it's just been really cool to stay connected. And now that she's bringing out my second book, it's like, oh, wow, this couldn't be more perfect, you know?
Wonderful, wonderful. Would you like to give any other shout outs to your community before you brag about yourself a little bit more, my friend?
Oh, well, yeah, I did want to shout out to Highlander Press, of course. I just so much appreciate. So this is the American edition of 14 Stones, which was first released in New Zealand. So also shout out the Patchwork Raven who brought the book into the world first. So that's just been really cool. And I wanted to also mention Charm City Readers, which is a Facebook organization for us local folks. Yay! And I've recently connected with them. It's been really awesome. And also the folks at the Right Review, Annie McDonnell and her team. That's been really cool to connect with as well. And then I know a bunch of really wonderful writers on Facebook who have been super supportive. We've all been cheering for each other through all kinds of ups and downs and everything. So that has been really wonderful.
Love it. And this is one thing I love about Maryland. We have a huge hub of writers, and I didn't even know.
Mm-hmm. And also that brings up another one, Eastern Shore Writers Association.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Are you part of the Maryland Writers Association or the Right Women Network?
I'm not, and I should be.
I'll hook you up and we'll trade some connections. I love it. I love it. Cool. Well, go ahead and tell us where we can find you, your books and more, and we'll wrap it on up, my friend.
Sure thing. So my website is my first name, last name, KrisFaatz.com. That's FAATZ. And my books, my first one was To Love a Stranger, which is historical fiction, came out in 2017. The new one is 14 Stones, which came out end of June. And I've got a third one that's kind of in the works. We don't have a plan for it yet, but it is finished. That one's called Line Magic, and that's also historical fiction. So my website is probably the best place to find me. I'm also going to be doing a workshop at Community College of Baltimore County. That's going to be in August. It is kind of a development of a place to stand that I mentioned before. So the idea of using creativity and writing specifically as a way of staying grounded when going through challenges or processing challenges, that's going to be kind of what we're talking about there. And I'm going to be doing a Zoom class with Highlander Press on fiction craft, and that one starts in August. So all of this is up on my website. I'm also on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook, so you can find me any of those places.
And we've got the description box full of those links for you all. Thank you so much for hanging out, Kris, and I hope to have you back in a couple of months to a year and see how things are going for you.
That would be awesome.
Thank you. You all have a wonderful day. Take care of yourself. Your voice matters. Dang it. Again, thank you to everybody who has participated in every season so far. If you would like to join again, that description box link is ready and waiting for you, or you can go ahead and catch all 4 seasons complete and on the replay. Between season 5's launch and now, we are going to start posting all 4 seasons on other entities such as Spotify and more. Thank you so much for supporting healing journeys and healing stories. Take care of yourself. You've always been worth it.